This is what everybody considers a good technique, which is absolutely right, but it's this part. Not this. Can you spot the difference? Another one. This is practicing technique. Not this. Or lastly, my father versus my wife. Oh, I've noticed so many times there's a big misconception about what having technique means on your instrument. And this is not instrument specific. You see this kind of culture towards technique everywhere among musicians. We tend to want to skip the important part and go directly for that flashy outcome, playing fast and difficult lines. But this is not having technique. Rather, this might be the result of a good technique. Technique simply addresses how to reach your goal in an effective and comfortable way. You can have plenty of technique and play very slow, or play very fast without having too much technique. Even more, to enhance your technique, it doesn't necessarily require you to produce even sound. Sounds confusing? Consider this analogy example in which you probably don't have too much experience, so that helps us to zoom out for a bit and put things in perspective. Insert my father, who has been playing for over 30 years of table soccer and who's a pretty fast attacker. When I play, I'm making the classic practicing to play fast mistake all the time here when I try to imitate one of his fast swipe and shoot moves. I've seen my father do this move so many times, although I've seen flashes of it, frankly. I always try it at my personal fastest speed and fail almost all the time miserably imitating this move. Even when I succeed one of those few times, it's an absolute lucky shot. He, on the other hand, will be happy to tell you the complete philosophy behind every micro part of the move. So, do it slow first. But not just slow, that's only scratching the surface. It doesn't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. It doesn't mean a thing if you're not mindful about it. It's being aware of every micro step involved, being in control, and being very efficient and accurate with your movements. It's about knowing all that in anticipation, and being fast follows from all that. Ta-da! The end! No. Back to Charlie Parker. If you're practicing for technique, you practice the way of carrying out a task, the actual movements involved. Why do I think Charlie Parker has a great technique? Well, he was very much in control of his fingers and movement, and by extension, his body.
Let me play with your body, baby, make you
And because of that, he was able to execute his dexterity, which follows from his impeccable technique. So here is a very basic definition of what technique actually is.
A way of carrying out a particular task, especially the execution or performance of an artistic work or scientific procedure.
This is obviously the Wikipedia description, but I do actually quite like it. But there's more to it and to gain from it. Let's separate those into a few key factors involved. First, we have control, with a subset of efficiency and accuracy. Then there is also probably a genetic component to it. And lastly, which Timothy added, which I thought was very interesting, an ergonomic factor. What does it actually mean to be in control of your instrument? You can try to become fast in a movement by practicing a musical phrase over and over on repeat. Sure, that's what I see most students in fact do. Or you can single out the motion and the movement, which in the long run will help you with any fast or difficult line to ever come in your life. To be really in control, you also need to know clearly before executing your goal what your motion will be. That means the more clear your aim is, the more clear your execution. In other words, anticipation. Next part of having control is that you want to be as effective as possible in this motion. When you're effective, you gain some essential time which gives you more control over your instrument to be deliberate. Or as Kenny Werner described it in his book Effortless Mastery, most musicians play while holding tension in parts of their bodies that don't need to be tense. That tension is the result of their basic relationship to playing, a pattern of struggle. You have to be so focused that your movement happens by itself. There is great tension, but it's purposeful tension, focused exactly where it's needed. So basically, it's about controlling your energy towards the right parts of your body. This seems to be easy advice, but I think we can all relate to how hard it is to relax when we are playing, for example with raising our shoulders. Another factor might be slightly more out of our control: genetics. Just like in the Tour de France, every cyclist, bike rider, or how do you call that, has its own specialty of which they are very aware. Some have those explosive muscles and generate very high speeds in a very short period of time. They are called sprinters. Others don't nearly generate that speed in absolute terms, but they can spread their energy way better over a longer time and win on completely different terrain, like for example the mountains. Sports is definitely not exactly the same as music, but what we do know is that we have all different genetic building blocks and we all have our weaknesses and our strengths. Me, for example, I have the tendency to have good reactionary muscles, which is exactly where my stronger points are on the saxophone and in sports. Once in a while I do actually keep out some shots of my dad. But on the other hand, I have way less natural ability to create linear, well-improvised lines, like for example Paul Desmond and Chet Baker had plenty of. They in turn relied less on speed in their playing. However, I don't have scientific evidence in an actual musical context here, but if you do, which either confirms or disconfirms it, please share it in the comment section below. I would love to hear that. So for that last factor, Timothy did the great observation, so I'll let him do the talking.
So the fourth factor is ergonomics. Ergonomic basically means optimization. I came across the idea of ergonomic playing through Tim Miller's book actually, where he just mentions it in passing, but it really got me thinking. When you start out playing jazz and learning to improvise, you'll always get referred to Charlie Parker and the Omnibook, and you have to learn Charlie Parker solos and you have to play through the Omnibook, etc, etc. And while that certainly has its value, it's important to understand when you introduce that in your study and practice if you're not a saxophone player. A funny thing I didn't know for a very long time, which Jorre actually pointed out to me, is that those lines that Charlie Parker is playing so effortlessly and fluidly are easy to play on the alto in those particular keys. If you play the same line in a different key, the fingerings would be all messed up and it would be much harder to play. So, given the fact that a guitar, in my case, is obviously not a saxophone, it doesn't make too much sense to expect the same ease to play those lines played by saxophone. That doesn't mean that it can be done, because obviously it can, but I would not suggest you build your foundation on that, because you're never really learning to play a guitar like a guitar, if that makes any sense. I am a living example of someone who was told to play Parker solos and saxophone solos and blah 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 blah, but by doing that and not focusing first on guitar players, I missed a big foundational chunk in my playing. Learn to play Albert King, learn to play Jimi Hendrix, Joe Bass, learn to play Tosin selective picking thing, whatever it is. If you're a guitarist, start with guitarists. I've said this a couple of times before. Alan Holdsworth was known to be influenced by saxophone, but his lines are absolutely not the way a saxophone player would create or play lines. It's incredibly guitaristic. It's optimized for guitar. Of course, it can be challenging to play, but overall, obviously, it lays well on the neck. Every instrument has their own idioms. Learn orchestration and you'll find that out very quickly. And different things are easier to play on different instruments. So I guess what I'm trying to say is learn your instrument, learn the tradition of your instrument, learn the strengths of your instrument first, and then expand and introduce things from other instruments.
I hope you learned a thing or two, or at least you can a bit relate to how we both think about technique. But I'll briefly anticipate some reasonable questions that inevitably will come. What about Michael Brecker? He definitely didn't keep his fingers curved, which is usually considered the right way of technique because then your fingers are supposed to be in a relaxed state. He did quite the opposite of what they would advise on good technique. Straight fingers and going very far from his keys. Well, a few possible answers. There are just few, but there are people who swear with this flat finger approach, which you can find in some classical French school of piano technique. So it might be either deliberate or not. And it also could be, of course, that he just played amazing despite his technique. And believe me, I know how crazy that sounds, because if there is somebody that is recognized for his amazing technique, it is Michael Brecker, obviously. But at least on how I define technique, he didn't have a very great technique. What I would say is that what people generally refer to as him having great technique is that he had a great sense of time, amazing and difficult concepts of melodic lines, and some amazing agility, despite that he kept his fingers really far from his keys when playing fast lines even. Despite is the key word here. Having great technique can only help you a lot, but in the end it is whatever works for you. Remember this? Oh, well, anyways, I would never claim this is the only and absolute way to think about technique, but the vast majority of great players and mentors I have had over the years always talked about technique in this way, about being in control over the movements on your instrument, not about scales or speed. I guess many of you might disagree or at least have some variations on this topic. I'd be very happy to hear them in the comment section below. Anyhow, if you like this kind of content, you might leave a like or subscribe to our channel and put on that bell notification so you get notified when we release a new video. I'm Jorge Reiners from Sharp 11 Music and I'll see you next time. Blijf maar.